One of the more interesting genres of literature, if you pardon the anachronism, is the medieval religious play. These were theatrical pieces, often of explicitly liturgical origin, that dramatized some story from sacred scripture. And in my recent reading, one that caught my eye particularly was the 12th century Le Jeu d'Adam, known in Latin as the Ordo Representationis Ade. It's linguistically super interesting because it's written in Anglo-Norman French, but its stage instructions are in an easy-to-read medieval Latin. Up here on screen, I have a part of it that comes from Erich Auerbach's Mimesis. And what we can see here immediately is that within the space of 2 lines, there are 2 separate verbs to describe a single sensory process. Taste. We have guster, as in gustāre, and ne tastare in the following line. Salient to me is the fact that these both existed in Anglo-Norman French, but in modern French, tastare is not really used that much, but taste is the normal word for this sensory experience in English. The French goûter, which is related to the gustar we see in the first line here, is commonplace in modern French, but its descendants are rare in English. Etymologically simple as these 2 verbs may seem, they follow a fascinating semantic history across the Romance languages, and that's what I want to look at in today's video. As always, we will start our explanation with Latin. This gustare that we've just read comes from the Latin infinitive gustare. That seems to come from the unattested noun gustus. Now, gustus may be unattested, but the infinitive gustare appears in no less than Caesar's De Bello Gallico. In Book 5, Chapter 12 of this propaganda piece, when describing the eating habits of the Britons, Caesar says, Leporem et gallinam et anserem gustare fas non putant. They do not consider it right or lawful to eat hare, chicken, or goose. Now, in the example I use, gustare means either to taste or to eat, but there's evidence that in the classical period it had a wide variety of meanings. For example, the early writer of comedies, Plautus, employs the verb in his Casina, quod te postules gustare quiquam. Between Caesar and Plautus, we see a strict conservation of the literal sense of this verb, to taste or to eat something. But if we look at the lesser-known work, the Mostellaria, we actually see a metaphorical, figurative application of this verb. Gustare ego eius sermonem volo. I want to get a taste of his conversation. And this is important because these 2 meanings, this double meaning, the figurative and the literal for this gustare, continues on into Romance semantics. Phonologically, the medieval Tuscan noun gusto and verb gustare remain identical to Latin, perhaps with some subtle changes in vowel quality. In the Paradiso Canto 17, up here on screen, Dante employs the verb in its figurative sense. Nel primo gusto vital nodrimento. Nevertheless, the dominant sense in medieval Tuscan seems to have been the sensory experience, to taste. Ibero-Romance forms share a change in the first syllable, lowering the Latin u vowel, it was actually probably something a bit more like u represented here, into the closed o. So Latin gustus becomes gosto, Latin gustare, gostar. Portuguese speakers will recognize this as modern Portuguese conserves gostar and gosto. Old Spanish also had this form, and we can attest this in the first of Alfonso X's famous Siete Partidas, where we read oler, gostar, et taner. Semantically, the Ibero-Romance development is peculiar across both Spanish and Portuguese. You see, the Alfonso X attestation there explicitly takes the literal corporeal sense of the verb, but this isn't the dominant sense it took on throughout the Middle Ages in Old Spanish and Galician Portuguese. Here's an example from a mid-13th century document, the Bocados de Oro. It's written in Castilian, and here we see "E gosta el sabor del dormir." Very clearly a metaphorical, figurative use, liking the taste of sleeping. There's another attestation that shows us an important development in Spanish. And if you don't mind me using Old Spanish as the heuristic, I just found attestation much easier here. We see the figurative use of this verb, gostar, in the Traducción del Soberano Bien, which is a Castilian translation and adaptation of Saint Isidore of Seville's Sentencia. Here we see two interesting things: the continuation of the figurative sense, and in Spanish, the return of the Latin more closed, higher u sound, likely due to a direct reborrowing. And this seems to explain, by the way, why Portuguese has gostar and modern Spanish has gustar. Modern Spanish gets this vowel change through deliberate reborrowing of the original Latin. What's interesting is that from the 13th century onwards, this figurative meaning becomes dominant. In fact, we don't have that much attestation for this verb as a whole before the 14th century, and it explodes in usage afterwards. And this overwhelming preponderance of the figurative meaning could explain this curious semantic development in Portuguese and Spanish, in which this verb, gustare, which initially in Latin meant to taste or to eat something, has come simply to denote preference. It's come to denote that you like something. Me gusta el vino, gosto do vinho. Now, I ought to address the syntactic elephant in the room and recognize that the way Spanish and Portuguese both use this verb differs considerably. In Spanish, it's got this strange dative experiencer construction that confuddles so many students of the language. In Portuguese, it's slightly more simple, in which the verb acts transitively. That's why in Spanish, I would say me gusta el vino, literally the wine is likable to me, whereas in Portuguese, it would be gosto do vinho, I like of the wine. However, I'm going to leave that for another video because it's complex enough to merit its own treatment. For now, let's look back at French because that's largely what we came to this video for. Old French goes the way of Ibero-Romance, transforming gustare into goster. Middle French then raises that first vowel, but like Spanish comes to, and we move from goster to guster. Then, constant cluster simplification, the oldest trick in the Romance book, reduces guster to goûter in modern French. Now, from what I know, modern French rarely uses goûter. Modern French speakers seem to prefer to use the verb déguster when referring to taste. However, I have many gaps in my knowledge on French, so if I'm incorrect there, please let me know in the comments. From my reading, both the literal and the figurative meanings of this verb survive in French. More specific to the jeu d'Adam that we looked at earlier, Anglo-Norman French seems to have been somewhat more conservative. It looks as though this verb was actually guster in the infinitive, or either that or it simply reverted to the older Latin form when in participle form. That's why we get gustar in the jeu d'Adam. But that covers only one of the words for taste present in this play. Ne taster is in the second line of the excerpt we looked at, and it's not difficult to link that to the modern English taste. The Anglo-Norman French verb traces all the way back to the Latin taxāre, and Aulus Gellius in his Noctes Atticae uses this verb. You can see this up on the screen, and the context indicates that this taxāre Gellius uses means to touch or feel, not to taste or eat. Other Latin writers like Suetonius and Seneca also use their verb, and in their usage, we do see a slightly more metaphorical definition, but this is not the dominant usage, and its referent meaning initially is much more physical, much more tactile. Now, usage after taxāre in classical Latin is admittedly difficult to attest, so we have to rely on some hypothetical reconstructions. Wikipedia tells us that taxitare was actually used as an iterative form of taxāre, that is to say that when one wanted to refer to repeatedly touching something, Latin speakers would use this verb taxitare. And from taxitare, we get the vernacular, late Latin, tastare, but still meaning to touch. Now, if we look at the history of this word throughout the four major Romance languages, we see an interesting pattern develop. Italian is very conservative in its meaning even today. For example, the modern Italian tastare means to feel out something, to touch something. For example, you can tastare un pacco to try and determine the contents of a package. Spanish and Portuguese is super interesting. There's an obsolete verb, tastar, in Spanish, which is like the descendant of taxāre and thus taxāre, but the Real Academia Española's Diccionario de la Lengua Española notes that it's not an absolute certain derivation. Semantically, however, it seems highly likely. It does, interestingly enough, appear in the 14th century De Secreto Secretorum by Juan Fernández de Heredia. This old Spanish text has the following sentence, where tastar is clearly, by its context, used in the sense of taste as we have it today, one of the five senses. So it's made the semantic jump from to touch, which is expressed in the citation by tocar, all the way to the sense of taste that we saw in gustare in Latin. However, this tastar verb is no longer used in Spanish, if I'm not incorrect. Once again, if I'm overlooking something important, please let me know in the comments down below, because I'd be interested to hear if modern Spanish speakers actually still use some derivation of tastar. Old French, like Italian, is quite conservative semantically here. It had the verb tastare, which meant to touch or to hit, and importantly, was sometimes used as to taste. And this seems to have continued all the way into Middle French. And thus, it became part of Norman French and eventually Anglo-Norman French after the Norman conquest of 1066. And precisely because French inherited these two verbs from Latin, gustare and taxāre, we see them attested in the jeu de dames. It's also interesting to me that this is the reason why modern English has taste. In fact, that taste in English replaced the Germanic form, which was smack. My pronunciation of Middle and Old English is not excellent, so I'm just going to leave the text up here in front of you. But this was actually the inherited or native way of expressing taste in English before the Norman conquest. It still survives in English to a certain extent. When we use the expression, it smacks of something, for example, his apology smacks of smug complacency, we're actually employing that older meaning of taste. It seems, it tastes odd, off, or it tastes of some other thing. Now, I really enjoyed tracing the semantics and, to some extent, phonology and morphology of these two Latin verbs throughout history. Do you have any other interesting examples of semantic shifts in verbs from Latin relating to the five senses? It's interesting to me because often these have a very concrete semantic origin, but one that lends them very easily into metaphorical and figurative application. And so we probably can see them spreading across Romance languages. And we probably use a lot of their descendants today without even realizing that they initially had this very concrete corporeal meaning. I'm going to leave this video at that and say thank you very much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And until I get to read them, I'm going to bid you adieu and see you in the next video.